people will give all sorts of different reasons for learning Latin. Just like they'll give, again, my experience as a musician speaks to this, because what you hear about why we should have music education in schools is like, well, makes it better, makes you better at math, and that
It's like,
kind of
oh, so what
thing.
you care about is math, not music.
Right, right, exactly. Or it's good for socializing, and look, I mean, the ancients would make arguments not unlike this in a way, maybe less utilitarian in the sense, oh, it just helps you learn this other discipline or something like that. But it wasn't so much music for its own sake necessarily back then either. It was for moral formation or things like that.
Yes.
But whereas as a musician, I'd be more like, well, music is just good, But but with Latin, people will make similar arguments. They'll say, well, it forms your mind in such and such a way. It helps you to recognize the roots of English words. You'll understand scientific and medical vocabulary better. And I don't know, what are the other kind of standard arguments that are given?
Teaches you discipline. It teaches you what a rational system looks like. Things
and
like
these
this.
things are all true and have value. But they are not necessarily getting to the heart of the value of learning a language, right? And so from where you're coming at the ALI, and a lot of people who are advocates of this particular approach to language learning, what would you say instead?
Oh, yeah, I think it's to read great Latin texts, first and foremost. And I think that some of these arguments, which in truth bear at least resemblance to older arguments for learning Latin about formation and stuff, they are kind of victims, or these arguments are predetermined by bad pedagogy. And so people will end up making weird arguments about the Latin language itself because of the pedagogy they've been exposed to. And so you mentioned this Mary Beard essay, which is a great historian of Rome, says, oh yeah, I can't sight read Latin, like oratorical Latin. And that's fine, okay. But then she argues that, and no one can actually be expected to understand Cicero without diagramming him out and stuff. And so this is kind of absurd on its face. I mean, these orations we have from Cicero were given in a courtroom to defend his friends. They were meant to be convincing to the people who were there. There's nothing about Latin that's inherently incomprehensible. And so I think that he would be a bad lawyer if he got up there and just went on, and people are like, where's the verb? This is the experience of reading Cicero. Where's the verb? But when you understand Latin on an intuitive level, you're not mentally searching for the verb. When you have this big periodic sentence and the verb's waiting at the end, that feels like a big bang on the cymbal right at the end. That's wow, the effect hits you, rather than it being inscrutable and then having to rearrange it in your mind. And these kind of strange instrumental arguments that, by studying Latin, you learn discipline, or you learn learn how to think logically. I think, if I can psychologize, I think they come out of people's experience studying Latin and learning to think logically and learning discipline and appreciating elegant systems, without actually learning Latin, without having a command of the language. And so they're like, well, it must have been for something, so it was for these other things. And if they could get the experience of putting their feet up at the fire and reading the Gospel of Matthew in the Vulgate and just, loving it.
Yeah.
I think they'd be like, well, okay, obviously the number one thing is you want to be able to read Latin texts.
Right.
And then that comes out really strongly when, you get to something that's the spirit, kind of the language of the church. And so you get access to the prayers and liturgy that were composed in this language. They're meant to be in this language. And then they get translated, and it's not like you can't pray the Hail Mary in English. You should. But when you're like, now I can do Ave Maria and really understand
yes,
what I'm saying. Or you can read Latin poetry. Poetry is the thing that really, every translation is kind of a paraphrase. Like prose, narrative. You can translate it and you're like, depending on what it is, you're getting a pretty good experience of it. Right. But the whole effect of poetry, and I think oratory is similar. The whole effect of it is auditory. It's meant to be heard.
Right.
And you cannot recreate the sound with a translation. You can recreate the sense, but oftentimes the closer you get to the sense, the worse poetry it is.
Yeah.
The more literal of a translation of a poem you do of a poem, the worse it's going to be in that language. And so the really interesting, beautiful translations of poetry are kind of their own works that paraphrase the poem.
Right.
And so, I think...
like Alexander Pope's,
right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is like, it's not really Homer, but it's cool.
Yeah.
And so I think on an individual level, if you are like, should I learn Latin? Okay. Well, do you want to spend long hours of suffering in order to come out the other side to be able to enjoy reading stuff in Latin? No? Then you probably should. Yes? Then you definitely should. Yeah. And so I think there's multiple arguments, though. That's like the individual argument if someone comes to me and asks me. But honestly, if you have that desire, that question is the answer. Of course. Why are you asking? You want to. You should. There's a secondary argument now, getting back to a different part of your question, about the classical education movement.
Right.
This is a political question. And I don't mean this like, should we vote on it? Well, maybe we should. But I mean it just in terms of, it's not just about me and what I want to do. Like, do I want to spend long hours on this stuff? Yes, I do. So I should. Mm-hmm. But should we, as a people, let's say Americans, have this in schools? And the classical education movement is a collective, subculture of people that have said, yes, we need this. It's really important. And the arguments for doing that are similar to the ones we've laid out, but they take on kind of a new dimension when you're thinking politically, when you're thinking about groups of people. Because then it's not like, should we ask each 8-year-old, do you want to learn Latin? Mm-hmm. Like, you could read Virgil. And like, an 8-year-old would be like, what in the world are you talking about? I want to go outside and play. Virgil, who the heck cares? But you have to force kids to do things they don't want to do because they're good for them. And so should we, make this a priority in our schooling? Because we choose to force our kids to do all sorts of things. Right. And just looking at school, like we're going to make them learn how to read. We're going to make them how to do arithmetic, and all this other stuff. Should Latin be part of that? And the classical education movement, by and large, has said yes. Within the classical education movement, there's all sorts of debates. Do you have to make Latin and Greek part of it for it to actually be classical, or can classical have this more expansive meaning that's like about great books and not necessarily about the language learning? And so kind of like the pedagogy argument. And there's all these people who, within the communicative methods, who disagree, but they're kind of basically on the same page. Same with the classical education movement, I'd say. There's kind of this broad agreement that these more traditional methods and more traditional texts and more traditional disciplines are good, and we need to go back to that.
Yeah.
What the details of that are is, hotly debated, I would say.